all of us on this panel had the privilege of studying feminist theology before it existed. I became a feminist in the fall of 1969. That was my second year as a graduate student in religious studies at Yale, and the year that Yale admitted women to the undergraduate college. When the New York Times ran a front-page story on the entry of women, and Yale prepared for women's education by hiring a gynecologist and putting full-length mirrors in the bathrooms, two graduate women called an open meeting to discuss how it was that we had been at Yale for 80 years and nobody had noticed. I went to the meeting out of curiosity, really, and I found myself in a room with about 50 other women. Very few of us were feminists at the time. I certainly wasn't. The fact that we were at Yale meant that doors had been opened to us, and I think probably most of us assumed that doors were open to any woman who was good enough, and of course I put that in quotes. The combination of suspicion, dismissal, surveillance, and condescending courtliness we met at Yale was something that most of us had never before experienced. We began meeting weekly and talking about our lives at Yale and outside it, and we called ourselves the Yale Women's Alliance. As I recall, we spent about half of each session on consciousness raising and half on activist issues connected to life at the university. The process of our meetings that fall was life-changing for me. It was a conversion. As I began to connect my personal history with my new understandings of women's socialization and social roles, my whole way of looking at the world began to shift. And since I was a graduate student in religious studies, it was hard not to apply my new feminist insights to religion. Carol Christ was one of the other women at the initial gatherings of the Yale Women's Alliance, the only other woman in religious studies there, and we fairly quickly began to relate our growing feminist awareness to our studies in theology. We began to notice, for example, which we hadn't before, that we had never been assigned a single book or article by a woman. We began to notice the dreadful things about women said by virtually every theologian we were studying. When Carol wrote a short seminar paper on Karl Barth connecting his statement that women are ontologically subordinate to men with his hierarchical understanding of God and creation, it helped launch both of us on our way to becoming feminist theologians. We eagerly read Mary Daly's The Church and the Second Sex, invited Rosemary Ruther and Claire Randall to speak at Yale, and somehow discovered Valerie Saving's feminist critique from 1960. The result of these explorations for me was that in the spring of 1972, despite the opposition or non-support of virtually the whole faculty, I decided to write a feminist dissertation. I wanted to root Saving's theological critique in a non-biological understanding of women's experience. I wrote on two Protestant theologians, Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich, because I was studying Protestant theology. I didn't think theology was central enough to Judaism that a feminist dissertation on Jewish theology would contribute to religious change, which was an important part of my agenda. My choice to write a feminist thesis, I think perhaps the second in the United States after Rita Gross's, marked the beginning of my involvement in the beginnings of women's studies and religion. In the summer of 1972, I attended the Conference of Women Exploring Theology at Grailville. There I met Elizabeth and began another friendship that was to have a very important impact on my development as a feminist scholar. And it was there that I first experienced the power of women doing theology together. The wonderful small group I participated in that week tried to capture the significance of feminist community by exploring consciousness raising as a religious experience, and then talking about the relationship between Eve and Lilith as a paradigm of sisterhood. Though I was scarcely aware of it at the time, my writing The Coming of Lilith at Grailville represented my first incorporation of Jewish modes of thinking into my attempts to theologize. In the fall of 1972, I became co-chair with Joan Arnold Romero of the Women in Religion group of the American Academy of Religion during the second and third years of its existence, and I often wonder what happened to Joan. Like many women, she dropped out for absence of a community. We followed Mary Daly as chair of the group, and I'll never forget the excitement of those early sessions as we squeezed into rooms far too small to contain either the numbers or the energy of those who gathered, knowing we were off to explore uncharted continents. In 1973, the first year of the program, I was a research associate in women's studies at Harvard Divinity School. The associates didn't teach that first year. That wasn't the initial conception of the program. Rather, we were given the job of transforming the Divinity School curriculum to reflect the emerging scholarship on women. I can't claim to have much success in getting the theology department to change at the behest of a 26-year-old graduate student, but my time at Harvard certainly forced me to articulate the challenge of feminist theology and provided me with another important experience of feminist community. Then in 1974, I moved to New York and had the privilege of participating in the early conversations of the New York area feminist scholars in religion, again with Carol and Elizabeth. It was there that I was first challenged by goddess theology, heard Karen Brown's early work on voodoo, Naomi Goldenberg's work on dreams, and thrashed out many issues in an emerging field with a group of extraordinary women. In the same period that I was becoming a feminist academic, I was undergoing a parallel, though in many ways more difficult, process of conscientization as a feminist Jew. Ironically, I discovered feminism at precisely a moment in my personal life when I was also exploring traditional Judaism. While I was attending the Yale Women's Alliance, I was spending Saturday mornings sitting in the back of the chapel, a non-member of a minyan consisting mainly of male undergraduates. One Sabbath, as my new husband and I were standing outside the chapel chatting with a friend, a student came out and urged my husband to come in immediately to make the minyan, the quorum, for prayer. I suddenly realized that though I had been attending services for over a year and he was a relative newcomer, my presence was irrelevant for the purpose for which we were gathered. That was an enormously important click moment for me. My experience that morning led me to develop a talk entitled "Can a Woman Be a Jew?" that I presented in a number of contexts in the early 1970s. My answer was an ambivalent yes. On the one hand, of course, women are Jews, Jews who have led rich and committed Jewish lives through the centuries. And on the other hand, Judaism's a bit like color blindness. Women pass it on, since the Jewishness of a child is determined by the mother, but they don't often contract it. Excluded from public prayer and study, women are excluded from the heart and soul of traditional Judaism. My conflicted relationship to Judaism in this period was reflected in the talk I gave at the first Jewish Feminist Conference in 1973. There I argued that the identity of Jewish feminists, and I'm quoting myself, lies somewhere in the conflict between being a woman and being a Jew, and in the necessity of combining the two in as yet unknown ways. We are here, I said, because a secular movement for the liberation of women has made it imperative to raise certain Jewish issues now, because we will not let ourselves be defined as Jewish women in ways in which we cannot allow ourselves to be defined as women. I was speaking as someone who had discovered a new source of community and identity in feminism and who desperately wanted to find and help bring its energy and transformative insights into the Jewish community. Throughout the 1970s, however, I felt stymied in this quest. I had difficulty finding either a worship community in which I felt comfortable or an ongoing context in which to explore Jewish feminist questions. I characterize my academic and Jewish feminist lives as developing on parallel tracks because, in fact, there was a certain disconnection and even tension between them. By the mid-1970s, I had a wonderful group of feminist colleagues in the American Academy of Religion with whom I developed a fairly nuanced scholarly understanding of the role of women in Western religion. We analyzed women's exclusion from public religious roles and the absence of women's experiences and perspectives from theology and religious symbolism, but we also realized that this exclusion was not the whole truth, that women had found ways to express ourselves religiously within and against traditional frameworks. In the Jewish context, however, the realities of women's subordination and exclusion were far more real to me than the ways in which we had carved or might someday carve a niche for ourselves within this patriarchal tradition. Several pivotal events in the early 1980s led me in the direction of an integrated Jewish feminist identity that also changed my life as a scholar. First, in the summer of 1980, I decided to teach a course on Jewish feminist theology at the First National Havurah Summer Institute, essentially an adult learning camp for countercultural Jews. It was my first opportunity to raise in a Jewish context the theological questions that most excited me, and I had no idea whether anyone would be interested in taking such a class, but in fact, several people came to the Institute precisely for that reason. The seriousness with which the women and two men present grappled with difficult theological questions gave me my first taste of Jewish feminist community. It was an incredibly exhilarating teaching experience and a moment in which the separated aspects of my life began to come together. And I think you can certainly hear the resonances with what Letty said earlier today. Partly as a result of the excitement generated by a number of feminist courses at the Institute, a group of women decided to create a space in which we could explore feminist issues in a more focused and ongoing way. In May of 1981, 16 Jewish feminists gathered at the Grail Retreat Center in Cornwall-on-Hudson with the modest goal of reconfiguring Judaism in 4 days. That weekend became the founding meeting of Benot Eish, Daughters of Fire, a feminist spirituality collective that has been meeting annually ever since. I now had a Jewish feminist context within which to explore feminist questions and attempt to create a feminist Judaism. Benot Eish was a space in which we could not only talk about feminism, but could bring into being some of the changes that we hoped someday might be incorporated into the larger Jewish community. Benot Eish was crucial in helping me move from an angry sense of powerlessness to a vision of a transformed Judaism, but that change did not come swiftly or easily, nor was it due to Benot Eish alone. Rather, a confluence of factors moved me in a new direction. On the academic side, the publication of Elizabeth's In Memory of Her was a crucial turning point for me. Reading the book for an AAR panel, I think it was in 1983 when it first appeared, I found myself struggling mightily against its fundamental premises. When Elizabeth argued that the Christian past is women's own past, and that to assume that androcentric texts accurately depict reality is to collude in women's oppression, I kept scrawling in the margins, how do you know this? Isn't this an enormous assumption, indeed an a priori commitment? At some point, I realized I was resisting being thrust into a place of unaccustomed and frightening power. To accept the notion that religious history is the history of women is to have to move beyond nursing one's grievances. to confront the huge task of reconstructing women's history and demanding that that history be integrated into every aspect of religious and communal life. Coincident with my beginning to make this shift was my coming out as a lesbian. This huge step for me could have certainly added more fodder to my anger at Judaism, in that it threw into bolder relief the relationship between its sexism and its heterosexism. But in fact, coming out freed me to claim my own power on the emotional and spiritual levels, just as In Memory of Her was encouraging me to do on the intellectual level. In part, I attribute this effect to a deep connection between sexuality, embodiment, and creativity that I experienced powerfully at this point in my life. But also, I think that having walked through one closed door and survived, I realized that I could also walk through others. A third pivotal event that occurred in 1983 is that toward the end of our second retreat, B'nai Eish resolved to stop seeking a common denominator in prayer that we would never be able to achieve. Instead of trying to reach consensus on how to worship together, we would empower individual women to take turns creating the liturgies that they wanted to experience, and we would agree to just be present and to try on things that might challenge our own proclivities and boundaries. This crucial decision ushered in many years of exciting liturgical experimentation. All of us began to appreciate the various, sometimes radical ways in which we could incorporate our voices as women into the liturgy and still maintain ties to the deep structures of tradition. It was the confluence of these events that enabled me to begin writing Standing Again at Sinai, and in doing so, to bring together the critical and constructive academic feminist and Jewish feminist commitments in my life. I was able to draw on many years of conversations with Christian and post-Christian colleagues in the academy to articulate a feminist vision that went beyond Judaism and still also feel that I was speaking out of and for a very particular Jewish feminist community. I never felt alone in working on that book. I experienced it as thoroughly grounded in and emerging out of 20 years of feminist and Jewish feminist experimentation and writing in which I had participated along with many others. Now, we were asked to talk about how we came to see feminism as resonant with the liberating core of our tradition. As is perhaps clear from the silences in what I've said, I did not come to this new place in my life because of any conviction that the core of my tradition is sympathetic to the liberation of women. I don't see Jewish tradition primarily as a source of overarching values that can be abstracted from certain texts and historical contexts. I see it as a huge and often unwieldy bundle of texts, traditions, laws, practices, folkways, and so on that constitute the past and establish the foundations for the future of the Jewish people. Just as individuals continually reevaluate, select, and reorder elements of our own personal histories as we move through our lives, so Jewish communities can sort, reconfigure, and add elements to the bundle, drawing on those that best serve our needs. The core of our tradition is not a given, but a subject of fierce and ever-renewed debate over where Judaism should be headed and who will have the power to decide. It has been sobering to me in reflecting on my history to note how many of the watershed events in my own feminist saga and that of the academic and Jewish feminist communities in which I've participated occurred in the 1970s and 80s. I've experienced the 90s as a time of fragmentation and reconfrontation with the question of what comes next. B'nai Eish continues to meet, but with less clarity of focus. Women's issues have been integrated into the American Academy of Religion in ways that we could scarcely have imagined in the early 1970s, yet this has made it far more difficult to keep track of new developments. I see in both the larger liberal Jewish community and among many students an ignorance about the history of feminism, a reluctance to embrace the term, and a refighting of battles that we hoped and believed we had laid to rest 20 years ago. Through all this, two things have remained constant for me. Shortly after I finished my dissertation in the mid-1970s, I encountered a former professor of mine at the AAR, a man who always liked me but was very perplexed by my interests. "What are you going to work on," he asked me, "when you finish working on women?" "I'm never going to finish," I answered, and of course I haven't. Within this fundamental commitment, I also continue to hold on to the notion of women's power and responsibility to shape the future of our religious traditions as part of the broader project of repairing the world. Frail as this power often seems at this very frightening moment in history, I, like Elizabeth, am nonetheless grateful for the profound intellectual, spiritual, and political adventure on which my feminism has propelled me. It is one I could never have imagined when I walked into the first meeting of the Yale Women's Alliance 33 years ago.